Segregation during World War II was still apparent in society, even after the abolishment of slavery and the several amendments passed during the Reconstruction period. Jim Crow segregation still intertwined itself into American society, making the lives of African Americans harder. Military was no exception, as when African Americans volunteered to join the military, they were told that they would be put into separate, segregated positions and units as non-combatant roles like cooks, quartermasters, and gravediggers. This segregation in America provided difficulty for African Americans, but many rose to the challenge and still fought bravely for their country.
Of one man rising to the occasion above racial discrimination was Dory Miller, an African American born out of Texas. Dory enlisted in the Marines in 1939 at only 19 years old, and like all other African Americans, he was tasked with performing the simpler non-combat duties on the ship, such as making the beds or preparing the food. Dory Miller was assigned to the battleship called West Virginia, which was stationed at Pearl Harbor, and on December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. Dory Miller, when the air raid struck Pearl Harbor, was stuck below deck doing his daily duties, and when he felt the first torpedo's explosion, he quickly rushed to his battle station, and after seeing it was flooded, he went seeking for reassignment. He encountered the ship's communications officer, where he was told to go to the signals deck, where he found the ship's commanding officer mortally wounded. Dory Miller lifted his commanding officer to safety, and by then, the ship was heavily damaged by Japanese bombs. Seeing an unattended aircraft gun with no combat training at all, Dory Miller shot at enemy Japanese planes as they flew by. Dory Miller was later awarded with the Navy Cross for his bravery shown during the attack on Pearl Harbor, making him the first African American to do so. Dory Miller's actions burned brightly as an example of how an underprivileged and oppressed African American can rise above the racial discrimination in the military and in America. Back at home, another African American, A. Philip Randolph, was planning a march on Washington to protest blacks' exclusion from World War II defense jobs. Many African Americans believed that they were not being given an opportunity to show their patriotism, and some even went to say that they felt like they shouldn't fight in a war where the country treated them as second-class citizens. Randolph's fight to end segregation at home led to President Roosevelt passing Executive Order 8802, which forbidden discrimination against blacks in government and defense industries. This passing of Executive Order 8802 was a step in the right direction for America, as it would lead to the eventual end of discrimination in the armed forces.
African Americans had to contend with two battles. They had to fight for freedom at home and abroad during World War II. They made tremendous sacrifices in order to achieve this double victory, or better known as the Double V. The Double V signified that African Americans fight for two victories, which are to be accepted in the U.S. and to be treated as equals and to fight on the front lines and win World War II for their country. Many African Americans served in every branch of the military, but over 1 million were not allowed in. The African Americans who made it into these branches were put into segregated units and given lesser roles, but they still continued to fight for America even after the terrible treatment they had been given.
Some of the most famous black units included the 32nd Fighter Group, 76th 1st Battalion, and the Tuskegee Airmen. The 32nd Fighter Group was highly successful as they shot down 112 enemy planes and over 170 bomber escort missions across Europe. The 26th 1st Battalion was singled out by General George S. Patton of the Third Army for entering combat with immense courage and success. These black military units showed that African Americans could be just as successful in the war and that they would fight for a country who treated them as second-class citizens.
One of these groups, the Tuskegee Airmen, was supposed to be an experiment in which over 19,000 pilots and support staff from Tuskegee, Alabama would be put into the Tuskegee program, which would train them to fight in the war. This experiment was put into play when the civil rights movement felt that young African Americans with dreams of being pilots were not given a chance. Obstacles that stood in front of these young African Americans were the widespread belief that African Americans could not learn to fly or operate complex aircrafts, and that they were inferior to white people in combat situations. The perseverance of the Tuskegee Airmen showed as they became highly successful with over 150 distinguished flying crosses and helped the integration of African Americans into the U.S. Armed Forces. These African American units made the most out of their opportunities and fought for a better future.
The racial discrimination in America during the war wasn't only against African Americans. One extreme example are the Zoot Suits riots in Los Angeles, where racial tension grew to the point where all-out brawls happened throughout the city. These riots started between off-duty servicemen and the young Latinos in the community. These controversies started with the wearing of fancy loose-fitting suits by young Latino boys. They would be seen in the streets with their baggy trousers and long jackets heading into clubs and dance halls hanging with the whites. As zoot suits became more popular, the clothes got a more racist reputation as Latino youths were being called panchucos and being viewed as street thugs or gang members. The street riots got their name from the flashy zoot suits, but the violence was more about racial tension than fashion. The city ended up banning zoot suits instead of trying to deal with the racial tension instead. These riots in LA started from conflict over the mass amount of Mexicans joining the military, and when an eventual fight broke out on May 31st, the tension in the city rose to its top notch. The next couple days, the streets of LA were filled with servicemen hunting any people in zoot suits or anyone looking Mexican. Police watched from the side as Latinos were beaten and stripped and left bloody in the streets by these mobs of servicemen in clubs. These racial tensions spread and got worse as more riots broke out and everyone was involved. The Zoot Suits riots in LA looked like the solemn witch trials as Latinos in the community were chased and beaten endlessly. The complexity of LA at the time showed how far America had to go to end racial discrimination in the country and how hard that would be. After attacks on Pearl Harbor, people in America began to distrust Japanese Americans as they thought they were an enemy and couldn't be trusted. With that being said, President Roosevelt felt that the need to pass Executive Order 9066, which called for the relocation of Japanese to those internment camps spread throughout the West Coast. 117,000 lives were affected, with the majority of them being citizens of the United States. The movement of Japanese Americans into camps was a direct violation of the Constitution by not allowing 100,000 Japanese Americans a trial and taking their property without compensation. The relocation of Japanese Americans into internment camps is one of the most atrocious violations of American civil rights. Many Japanese Americans lost everything they owned and had to make major sacrifices to provide for their family before being sent away to these camps. They would sell their livelihood like their stores and businesses or prized possessions that hold significant value to them. These Japanese civilians were left with nothing and forced to live in these camps.
Opportunity struck as these internment camps offered the chance to join the armed forces. Japanese that were allowed into the forces were put into segregated groups, much like any other person of color. With the opportunity given, one Japanese American group, the 442nd Regiment, made strides in overcoming oppression in the military and showing immense patriotism for their country. They were treated more as a suicide squad rather than being loyal to America. The military treated them as expendable and sent them to some of the most dangerous areas throughout the war. These oppressed Japanese Americans fought even harder to achieve a double victory by helping America win the war. This would show how patriotic they are and that they should be treated equally. The 442nd, with only 2 years of combat, would become one of the most highly decorated units of that size with over 18,000 awards, including 21 Medals of Honor, and 9,486 Purple Hearts. Along with helping America win the war, the 442nd Legion provided a path for future generation Japanese Americans, as their patriotism and sacrifice allowed them to be recognized as brave and highly successful soldiers, making them an example of what it means to be an American.